This podcast is published at the moment of the full moon, which was at 6:17 p.m. on Friday the 18th of March 2022. This moment was itself in the shadow of another moment, the autumn equinox, which occurred just 56 hours and 10 minutes later. The autumn equinox is one of the quarter days, one of the 4 days that marks the Earth's cycle round the sun. The two solstices are when the days are longest or shortest, depending, and the equinoxes are when night and day are equal. They're significant markers in the Earth's year, and I'm going to be very happy to explore more about them as this podcast evolves. They've been honoured and celebrated by humans for millennia, and many of the Christian holy days have come from the pagan celebrations around the quarter days. This is particularly obvious when we remember that Easter, which is coming up next month, is always held on the weekend closest to the full moon after the equinox, which is why it changes dates every year. That most of us have no idea that Easter is connected not only to the full moon, but also to the equinox, is an indication of how much further we are from connecting our lives with nature's cycles than our ancestors were. G'day, this is Tied to the Moon, where we slide our minds between sheets of secular and sacred, story and idea, sacrament and profanity, and we wait and hope for grace. My name is Kate Lawrence and I am your host. One of my greatest joys is when one seemingly small decision to take an action gives up a myriad of other magical, unforeseen and delightful consequences. For example, when we moved to the forest town of Macedon, it was for the love of the natural environment. But within months, I realised the joys of a small community were every bit as appealing as the forest. Of course, we also realised then that it was an incredibly high bushfire risk area, which was not such an appealing unforeseen consequence. Or take the making of this podcast, where my original motivation was to give myself some accountability for the experiment of 1 day a week for rest. And now I find this action is having the most profound impact on my impetus to write, which in turn develops and deepens my thinking. And the other night, after dark, I was walking across my backyard and I caught the moon looking at me. And when I looked at her, I could tell there was less than a week to go before I had to finish this episode. She was like a calendar just hanging up there in the sky. Now, maybe I thought I'd have a greater awareness of the lunar cycle by publishing on the new and full moons, but to literally read the moon as a time marker was a tiny, thrilling moment I hadn't anticipated. And now I'm discovering a host of unexpected consequences of this line in the sand, stake in the ground, call it what you will, of a day of rest, this commitment to protecting Sundays from the ordinary, so much so that it's becoming the centre pole of the tent of my life. that I'm a pretty unstructured person? I think I have. But apparently you can't mention things too often on podcasts. So I'm pretty unstructured, or at least this is the story I've been telling myself ever since I met and started living with my partner Adrian, who liked to say that in our relationship his role was to bring order to chaos. But actually, unbeknownst even to me, I have harboured one vaguely followed routine, and I do know that's a contradiction in terms, but all of us are a bunch of living contradictions. Anyway, I have a mental attachment, the physical attachment of actually practicing the routine is less attached, to the idea of getting up on a Saturday morning and powering through a bunch of chores. Then, once they're done, the rest of the weekend is free. I am not sure when I developed this loosey-goosey habit, and I was far from consistent, but it was embedded enough in me to feel like a good rhythm for the working week. And even when I had kids and I was at home a lot during the week, the Saturday morning time where everyone was up and about, getting the house clean, doing some outdoor jobs, where the kids could all contribute, it felt really good. It felt really good to me, that is. Now, Adrian, he was a man born with a deep need and possibly a love of order. We were as night is to day in our approaches to structure. For example, our schemes for doing the laundry. Before I had children, my washing was done at totally random intervals, and it would sit for equally random lengths of time in the machine after the cycle, only remembered by the damp, mouldy smell, or when I went to do another load and saw the forgotten clothes which now needed to be re-washed. I was a little more focused after I had kids, but still with no routine. Adrian, on the other hand, had a washing regime bordering on military. Shirts every 4 days, other tops every 3 days, pants, shorts, pyjamas, undies and socks every 5 days, towels every second Saturday, bedding every second Sunday. This routine was set in stone. It was so rigid that if he came home late, I would find him sitting up until 1, 2 or even 3 a.m. waiting for the washing to finish because it had to be hung out as soon as the cycle had finished to avoid ironing. The washing regime wasn't the only routine Adrian had. There were rules for what clothes to wear depending on the predicted temperature, what TV shows to watch, and when to open the windows and when to turn the heater on. He went to bed exactly 8 hours before he had to get up, which on the weekend was 10 a.m, which meant he didn't go to bed until 2 a.m. Many of these regimes were not at all conducive to life with small children, and I happened to have 2 of them when we first met, and then we had a third 2 years later. So despite being in love, I found Adrian's rules incredibly frustrating, and I fluctuated wildly in my responses. I argued, I cajoled, I reasoned, I critiqued, I suggested, and I railed at the idiocy of his ways. I laughed and cried and yelled and pleaded, all to no avail. The systems were the anchor for him and his life. Let go of a system and who knew what might happen? And if I dictated what and how he was to do something, where was his dignity and sovereignty? So I switched, I allowed, accepted, I released. He was lovable and funny and steady. I could let go of having it done my way. I adjusted my domestic expectations. I wanted peace and his happiness. I wanted a partnership and to share the load. And he did do stuff. If it was on his schedule, it would get done. But if it wasn't on his schedule, it didn't even exist. He didn't even see it. And he was not at all attracted by the idea of Saturday morning chores. He wanted to get out of bed at 10, get dressed at 12, and then put some washing on. We tried to move closer to each other. He agreed to Saturday working bees, and we did do them for a while, but it was painful for everyone. I could have kept going and doing them on my own, for myself, but I carried this inherited bitterness that if others are doing nothing while I'm working, there is something terribly wrong. And so I either stop working or I become an unpleasant, whirling nightmare of harshness. So eventually, I let slip this idea of Saturday chores. Until on that first Sunday, a few weeks ago, years now after Adrian died, when I introduced a sacred Sabbath into my week and I lolled around relishing in the relaxation. At some point in the day, I noticed the dining room table and it was a mess. One end of the table was strewn with my work papers, and the rest of the table was fulfilling its role as the general dumping ground for all things that require that little bit of extra effort to put somewhere. It wasn't too bad. I'd seen it a lot worse. A little bit of effort would have had it sorted. But I had ruled that anything more than bare minimum housework was out of bounds on Sunday. So the table remained as it was, but it niggled me. So the following Saturday, I was filled with new intention and purpose. And while the day was fairly full, I made sure I did a few of the tasks that I often did on Sundays. I did some meal planning and shopping, and I tidied the dining room table and made sure the kitchen was in order. And then last week, which was the last in the waxing moon, my Saturday was totally transformed. I vacuumed, cleaned the kitchen, mopped the floor, put out the compost and the recycling. I did a meal plan, the weekly shop, and 3 loads of washing. The house looked and felt wonderful, clean and clear and peaceful. And I remembered the pleasure of this rhythm that I had let slip. It felt like I'd come home. By planting a stake in the ground of Sunday, the ripples outwards mean that now Saturday is a day of preparation for Sunday. And that means more structure all round. Of course, other weeks, barely anything's going to get done on Saturday in preparation for Sunday. I am not so wedded to cleanliness as to sacrifice other activities. But the consciousness that Sunday is different, it's sacred, means I will turn my mind to how to manage what needs to be done and how to take some small action to honour the space. To prepare even one corner to rest my eye upon, so that the house is at least one step up from what it might have been if Sunday was just another ordinary day. Thanks for listening to Tied to the Moon. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you listen, and tell other people about it. And if you have any ideas, suggestions, requests, comments or feedback, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes and contact details at storyground.com.au. The music for this podcast is by Danya from Audio Jungle. This podcast is a production of Storyground and me, Kate Lawrence, and it's made on the traditional lands of the Gunung Willumbullock at the foot of Mount Macedon, 65 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, Australia.